The heat that Tuesday morning came down like a judgment, not the dry, patient heat of a desert that has learned to wait, but something heavier, something with intention behind it, the kind of heat that presses against the skin and doesn't let go, that finds the space between your shoulder blades and settles there like a hand reminding you it could push harder if it wanted to. Hollow Creek, Arizona had that quality even on ordinary days. It sat in the high desert basin between two ridgelines that did nothing to shelter it from the sun. And the sun knew this, and the sun took full advantage. But this particular Tuesday in August was not an ordinary day. Wren Calloway had been awake since 4 in the morning. She hadn't needed an alarm. She hadn't needed one in 6 months. Sleep had become a thing that happened to other people, a rumor she heard about secondhand, something that existed in the life she'd had before the silence started, before the phone calls that went unanswered, before the reports that went nowhere, before something hollow crept into her mornings and made the act of getting out of bed feel like climbing out of something much deeper than a mattress. She had worked the breakfast rush alone. Gus Farrell had come in at 6 the way he always did, moving through the kitchen door with the particular deliberateness of a large man who has learned to be careful about the space he occupies. 61 years old, built like someone had stacked decades of hard work into a human shape, with hands that had been burned and cut and scarred into something that looked more like tools than body parts. He'd worked the diner for 11 years before Wren started, and he'd been there every single morning since, which made him the most consistent thing in her life by a considerable margin. He hadn't said much that morning. He rarely did before 7, but she'd caught him looking at her twice through the pickup window with an expression she recognized, the expression of a man who wanted to say something useful and couldn't locate the right words, so he was keeping the useful thing stored behind his eyes where it couldn't do any damage. She appreciated that about Gus. He understood the difference between comfort and noise. The Route 66 diner had no right to be as familiar as it was. It was not a beautiful building. It was not even a particularly functional one by any modern standard. The counter listed slightly to the left, a gradual tilt so subtle that you only noticed it after years of working there, when you realized your body had developed a compensating lean without your permission. The vinyl stools along the counter had been reupholstered twice and were cracking again along the seams, the foam showing through in small, bright lines like something trying to escape. The ceiling fan above the center of the room made a sound on every third rotation, a small mechanical click, like a clock marking time in a language only it understood. But Wren knew this place the way you know the inside of your own hand. She knew which booth wobbled if you leaned too far to the right, the third one from the window, the one the regulars called the teeter. She knew that the coffee in the back pot, the one she kept for herself and for Gus during the slow hours, was always stronger than the front pot by 30 seconds of brew time. And those 30 seconds made a difference that only someone who had been drinking it long enough would notice. She knew the way the light came through the east windows in the early morning and turned the chrome counterfittings into something briefly beautiful before the sun climbed too high and flattened everything back into ordinary. She knew every scratch on that counter. She knew which ones she'd made herself and which ones had been there when she started and which one a long diagonal line near the register had been put there by Colt on a slow Wednesday afternoon 2 years ago, when he'd been carrying a stack of plates and caught the edge of a butter knife and dragged it all the way across the surface before he caught himself. He'd felt terrible about it. He'd offered to pay for a replacement counter. She'd told him the counter didn't need replacing, that the scratch was character, that the whole place was held together by its scratches. She'd been looking at that scratch every morning for 6 months. The breakfast rush came and went the way it always did. Truckers and early commuters, and one table of retirees who came in every Tuesday and ordered the same things they had been ordering since a previous administration, and talked about the same things they had always talked about, which was mostly weather and football, and the general decline of everything, in a tone that managed to be both mournful and satisfied at once. Wren worked them with the ease of long practice, moving between tables with the efficiency of someone who has internalized a physical space so completely that navigation becomes unconscious. Smile at the right moments. Refill before they ask. Remember that the man in the corner booth takes his eggs over easy, not over medium, and that this distinction matters to him more than most people would consider reasonable. She was good at this. She had always been good at this. Her mother had told her once when Wren was maybe 14 and impatient with the slowness of it, that working tables was one of the last honest crafts left in the world. You read people for a living, her mother had said. You figure out what they need before they can say it. You make them feel like they matter for exactly as long as they're sitting in front of you. That's not nothing, her mother had said. Don't let anyone tell you that's nothing. Wren had thought about that a lot in the past 6 months, about what it meant to make people feel like they mattered, about whether she had done enough of that for the one person who had mattered most. By 11 o'clock, the breakfast crowd had thinned, and the lunch crowd hadn't arrived yet, and the diner settled into the quiet that settles between rushes when Gus would eat something standing at the counter, and Wren would refill the sugar dispensers, and they would exist in companionable silence without needing to fill it with anything. She was refilling the sugar dispensers when she heard it. It started as something she felt before she heard a low vibration that moved through the floor, through the soles of her sneakers, up through the bones of her legs. She felt it in her back teeth first, a frequency the body registers before the ears do. Then the sound arrived low and rolling the way thunder comes in from a distance when the storm hasn't decided yet how serious it intends to be. She set down the sugar container. Gus appeared in the pickup window. He had a spatula in one hand and an expression on his face that she had never seen there before in 11 years of knowing him. She didn't have a name for it immediately. It took her a moment to identify it as fear, because Gus Farrell was not a man who frightened easily, and the sight of that expression on that particular face was genuinely disorienting. Wren, he said. You hear that? She heard it. The sound grew from a rumble into a roar. Then it stopped being just sound. The coffee cups on the counter began to tremble in their saucers, not violently, just that subtle, high-frequency shiver of objects that have been given information they don't know what to do with. A magazine on the rack near the door slid sideways by 3 inches. The little bell above the door, which hadn't rung yet, swayed slightly on its mount, as if anticipating something. 2 customers were still in the diner. A man in a booth near the window, traveling alone, laptop open, coffee going cold, had stopped typing. His hands were flat on the table and he was looking at the window the way people look at things they're trying to decide whether to be afraid of. A woman at the counter with her teenage daughter had gone very still, and the daughter had reached under the counter and found her mother's hand without looking at it, which was a kind of instinct that didn't require explanation. The first motorcycle came into the window view like a dark comet, chrome catching the white August sun, the engine sound cutting through every other sound in the world for exactly 1 second, sharp and absolute, before the second one followed, and then the third, and then she stopped counting because the numbers stopped being useful. 40 motorcycles, maybe more, rolling into the gravel lot of the Route 66 diner with the coordinated precision of something that had done this 10,000 times. Death head patches, colors she recognized from a context she had never personally occupied, but had come to know very well over the past 6 months of desperate research. Hell's Angels. Behind her, the man with the laptop closed it and stood up in a single quiet motion. He put 3 bills on the table without counting them and walked toward the hallway that led to the restrooms. He didn't come back. The woman at the counter looked at Wren with an expression that asked a question, and Wren gave her a small nod, and the woman took her daughter's hand, and they were gone before the engines cut out. Gus hadn't moved from the pickup window. His spatula was still in his hand. His voice when he spoke was very quiet and very flat, the voice of a man who has stripped everything out of his tone except the essential information. Backdoor Wren. Right now. She didn't move. Wren. I heard you, Gus. She was watching the parking lot, watching them roll in one by one, the last of the engines cutting out almost simultaneously until the silence that followed was something physical. The specific silence that 40 motorcycle engines leave behind when they stop is not like other silences. It has a shape. It has a weight. It occupies the space where the noise was, and it does this so completely that the absence becomes its own kind of presence. She heard Gus set the spatula down on the counter. She heard him exhale. She heard him not say anything else, which was the loudest thing he'd done all morning. The door opened. He came in first. She would learn his name within the hour. Harlan Voss, National Enforcer. The man the entire chapter answered to when the situation had moved past the kind of thing that chapter leadership handled on its own. But in that first moment, filling the diner doorway with the quality of a man who has never once in his adult life had to consider whether he was taking up too much room. He was simply a wall of presence. 6'3", built like consequence. Dark hair going silver at the temples. A face that had been through things not destroyed by them, not marked by them in the way that breaks something, but shaped. The way a piece of hard wood is shaped by decades of use, the grain of it clarified the density made apparent. He had dark eyes that moved across the room slowly and without urgency. The way a man's eyes move when he is in a space he has already decided he controls, and the survey is merely administrative. Those eyes moved across the counter, across the stools, across the pickup window where Gus had gone very still, across the booths, the register, the rack of road maps near the door that hadn't been updated since the mid-90s. And then they landed on her. She didn't look away. Something moved in his expression, something small and fast that came and went before most people would have caught it. A fractional adjustment, like a man who has walked a familiar road for years and placed his foot on a stone he was not expecting to find. Not a stumble, just a recalibration. He walked to the counter and sat down on the stool directly in front of her. The rest of them filed in behind him. She heard them before she could fully see them, the sound of 40 people entering a space built for 30, the shift in air pressure when a room exceeds its intended capacity. They filled every booth, every stool. 3 men stood along the back wall with their arms crossed because there was nowhere left to sit. The diner that had felt perfectly ordinary sized at 11 o'clock on a Tuesday morning now had no available space in it at all. The air changed texture. Wren picked up her order pad. She walked to the counter. She stood directly in front of Harlan Voss, and she said the only appropriate thing there was to say. Coffee. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, yeah. She poured it. She was aware of her hand holding the pot. She was monitoring her hand. She was aware of the weight of the pot, of the heat rising from the surface of the coffee, of the angle required to pour cleanly without spillage. She poured cleanly. She set the pot down. She set the mug in front of him, and she turned and began taking the orders of the men on the nearest stools. Same tone she used every day. Same practiced efficiency. Same movement down the line as if this were a Tuesday like any other Tuesday, which it was not. And she knew it was not, and everyone in the room knew she knew it, and none of that changed the fact that her hand had not shaken when she poured the coffee. She was proud of that later when she had time to be proud of things. From somewhere near the back of the diner, she heard one of the men say something low to the man beside him. A voice not quite aimed at her, but not quite aimed away from her either. Something with a rough edge of amusement in it. Something about the girl having nerve. She didn't turn toward it. She didn't react to it. She finished writing down the order in front of her and moved to the next stool. For 20 minutes, the diner operated in a state of suspended normalcy. She took orders. Gus cooked. She could hear him back there moving with a focus that was slightly different from his usual rhythm. Tighter, more deliberate, the focus of a man who has decided that the most useful thing he can do right now is perform his function with absolute precision. The food came up. She delivered it. Coffee was refilled. She moved through the room the way she always moved, with purpose and without hesitation. Because hesitation in a diner is the thing that makes customers feel like they're an inconvenience. And customers who feel like an inconvenience don't come back. She was refilling Harlan's mug for the second time when it happened. The man she would later come to know as Briggs, broad-shouldered with a gray beard that reached the second button of his jacket and arms covered from wrist to collarbone in ink that had blurred with age into something that looked less like tattoos and more like a weather system, leaned over from his stool and said to Harlan loud enough for the whole counter to hear, in a voice that carried the weight of a man saying something he's been holding for miles. This is the place. This is where he used to work. The words dropped into the room the way a stone drops into still water. Everything that had been almost normal stopped being almost normal. The shift was immediate and complete, a change in the quality of attention in the room from the general low-level wariness of 40 men in an unfamiliar space to something focused, something directed. Wren set the coffee pot down on the counter. She turned around. Where who used to work? Briggs looked at her. Something moved across his face. It wasn't quite surprise, more like the expression of a man who had made a calculation and is now discovering that one of his variables was wrong. He glanced at Harlan. Harlan hadn't moved. He was watching her with those slow, deliberate eyes. She said the name before either of them could decide what to do with the silence. Colt Calloway. Not a question. A statement delivered from a place of absolute certainty because she had spent 6 months getting certain about the only thing she had left to be certain about. You're talking about my brother. The counter went quiet in a way that was different from the quiet that had preceded it. This was not the quiet of 40 people being careful. This was the quiet of 40 people who have just had the floor changed beneath them without warning and are still processing what the new surface feels like. She had their attention now, all of it. The full concentrated weight of the room, every set of eyes converging on one 23-year-old woman in a Route 66 apron with 6 months of grief compressed beneath her sternum, like a stone she'd been carrying so long she'd stopped noticing the weight until right now when the weight suddenly had somewhere to go. You knew him. Still not a question. Her voice was steady in the way a river is steady, not because nothing is moving, but because everything that is moving knows exactly where it's going. Harlan said nothing. He's been gone 6 months, Wren said. Nobody in this town will tell me anything. The police say there's no evidence of a crime. I've filed 4 missing persons reports and I have heard nothing back. The FBI won't return my calls. I drove to the field office in Phoenix twice. Twice, she paused. She was not performing composure. She was actually composed, which was a different thing entirely. And now you're sitting in his diner. Briggs said it's not his diner. No, she agreed. It's mine. But he worked here, and you knew him. And I am asking you right now directly to your face what happened to my brother. The room was so quiet she could hear the ceiling fan. Click. 2 rotations. Click. Harlan looked at her for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low and unhurried, the voice of a man who selects his words the way a careful person selects tools precisely for a specific purpose, with full awareness of what each one is capable of. You shouldn't be asking that question. I've been told that before, Wren said. It hasn't stopped me yet. Something moved in his eyes. Not warmth, not exactly. More like recognition. The expression of a man who has been playing a certain game for a very long time and has just realized that the person across from him is playing a different game than he assumed. Your brother made some choices, Harlan said. Some of those choices put him in dangerous company, I know. Then you understand why there are things that can't. I found the recordings. The sentence landed differently than everything else she had said. She felt the change in the room the way you feel a change in barometric pressure. Not visible, not audible, but physical. Real. Bodies shifted on their stools. Briggs straightened in a way that was not casual. 2 of the men near the back wall exchanged a look that contained an entire conversation. Harlan did not move, but his eyes, those slow and deliberate eyes, sharpened in a way that restructured his entire face. What recordings, he said. It was not a question. The ones my brother hid before he disappeared. Wren said. I found them 2 weeks ago. I've been listening to them ever since. And here is what I know. She held his gaze. She had rehearsed this moment. Not in the artificial way of someone who has written a script and is reciting it, but in the way you rehearse something true, something that you need to say exactly right, because the words matter, because the wrong word in the wrong place could collapse everything you've been building toward for half a year. She said he didn't betray you. He was set up, and whoever set him up is still inside your organization. Absolute silence. She let it sit. She didn't fill it. She had learned over 6 months of being the only person still looking for her brother. That silence was not the enemy. Silence was the space where truth had room to exist, and filling it too quickly was the surest way to chase the truth back out. Then she said the sentence she had said into her bathroom mirror at 2 in the morning so many times that the words had worn grooves in her. I know you didn't kill my brother because he died protecting one of you. The silence that followed that sentence was the deepest silence she had heard in 6 months of very quiet mornings. It had a texture to it, a density, the kind of silence that forms when a room full of people all arrive at the same understanding at the same moment, and none of them have yet decided what to do with it. She held it. She did not look away from Harlan Voss. She did not adjust her posture. She did not reach for the coffee pot or straighten her apron or perform any of the small physical gestures that people perform when they are nervous and want to look like they are not nervous. She stood exactly where she was, chin level, eyes steady, because she had one job in this moment, and the job was to stay exactly here. Harlan stared at her. Then he said very quietly, where are these recordings now? Somewhere safe. Not here. You came here alone. Yes, knowing we'd be here. I heard the engines, Ren said. I didn't run. She paused. I'm done running. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with an expression she was still learning to read, not threatening, not reassuring, but deeply evaluative. The look of a man who has spent decades making rapid and consequential assessments of people and is currently conducting one such assessment and is not going to hurry it, regardless of what the room expects. Then he looked over his shoulder at Briggs. The look that passed between them lasted 4 seconds. It contained questions and answers and decisions compressed into a unit of time so small that anyone watching from the outside might have missed it entirely. Then Harlan turned back to her. You're going to want to sit down, he said. Wren looked at him. I'll stand, she said. He almost smiled. It was the kind of almost smile that arrives before a person has decided whether the situation warrants the full thing. Not quite there, but present in the way that something is present when it's waiting just behind a door. All right, he said, then stand. He picked up his coffee cup. He took a slow drink. He set it down with the deliberateness of a man who has made a decision he is not going to walk back from, and the deliberateness itself was the announcement of that fact. Your brother, he said, and the world changed. She had known in the way you can know something that has been living in the back of your mind for months without ever quite coming to the front. She had known that whatever Colt had been involved in was larger than she could fully see. She'd known it from the recordings, from the way his voice changed in certain passages, dropping half a register, the careful register his speech took on when he talked about specific things. She'd known it from the silences between his sentences, the ones that lasted a beat too long, the ones that told her more than the words on either side of them. She had known the way you know a storm is coming before the sky has committed to anything. Not from evidence you can point to, but from the quality of the air in the hours before. But knowing a storm is coming and standing in the rain are two different things. Harlan spoke without apology and without the softening of language that people deploy when they're telling you something they believe you can't handle. He spoke to her as someone who could handle it, which she understood was a form of respect, even if it didn't feel like one in the moment. He told her that Colt had not stumbled into their world. He had been recruited deliberately carefully as part of an operation that Harlan described without naming directly, but with enough specificity that she understood its shape. Colt had been moving evidence, evidence against people in federal positions who had concluded that the authority they'd been given was a private resource rather than a public trust. He told her the club had believed Colt had run, had turned, had taken what he'd been trusted with and disappeared into whatever life a man builds for himself when he decides to burn every bridge behind him. You thought he was a traitor, Wren said. Yes. No hesitation, no softening of the word. Yes. And you were wrong. A pause. It's looking that way. She absorbed this. She turned it over in her mind the way you turn something over when you need to see it from every angle before you commit to understanding it. The man who sold him out, she said, he's still with you. If what you're saying is accurate, yes. He looked at her steadily. You're very certain for someone working from voice recordings. I'm certain Ren said because Colt named him. Not directly, but he described him. The way he spoke, the specific words he used. When I heard it, I knew. She met his eyes. You'll know too when you hear it. Harlan was quiet. Around them, the diner had achieved a stillness that felt almost impossible given how many people it contained. 40 men and none of them making a sound. Only the desert heat pressing against the windows and the distant highway, and two people at a counter having the most consequential conversation in the room. Why are you doing this? Harlan said finally. His voice had shifted slightly, not softer, more direct. The way a voice changes when it stops managing the conversation and starts actually asking. You could have taken those recordings to the press. You could have kept your head down. You walked in here alone and handed us the most dangerous thing you're carrying. Why? She looked at him for a moment. Because Colt is still alive, she said. The words landed in the space between them. I don't know where. I don't know what condition he's in, but I know he isn't dead. I know it the way I know my own heartbeat, not because I have proof, but because the alternative hasn't become real to me, no matter how long I've been staring at it. She paused. And I know that you have resources I don't have. You have reach that no journalist and no honest cop in this state has. I couldn't find him in 6 months of trying everything I knew how to try. She held his gaze. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for him. He gave something to your people. I need something back. Harlan looked at her. You're not afraid of us, he said. It was not an accusation. It was an observation delivered with something close to bewilderment. The expression of a man who has spent the better part of his life watching rooms go quiet when he walked into them and has not recently encountered an exception. I'm terrified, Ren said. Honestly, but I'm more terrified of the alternative, of going another 6 months without knowing, of filing another report that nobody acts on, of being the sister who was careful and quiet and well-behaved and lost him anyway. Her jaw tightened slightly. I'd rather be afraid in motion than safe and still. From somewhere in the back of the diner, Briggs let out a breath. It was not quite a laugh, but it was not unkind. Harlan picked up his coffee, set it down without drinking, looked at the surface of the counter for a moment as if reading something there. Then he looked back up at her. If you're right about the recordings, he said you understand what that means for the person who gave Colt up. Yes. You understand what we do in that situation. Yes. And you're still here. I'm still here, she said. He nodded once. Slow. The nod of a door closing or opening. She couldn't yet tell which. We're going to need to hear those recordings, he said. I know. Tonight. Tell me where. He looked at her for a long moment. She watched something change in him. Not warmth, not softness. Something more structural than either of those acetling. The way a man looks when he has made a decision that he won't revisit when the internal argument is over and only the action remains. You're going to trust a room full of Hell's Angels, he said, with the only evidence you have. That's not a small thing. No, Ren agreed. It's not. Why? She looked at him. Because Colt trusted you, she said, and he was right to. Somebody else let him down. But not you, not your people. She held his eyes. And because I have nowhere else left to go. The words sat in the air between them. For the first time since she had walked out from behind the counter and taken her position in the center of everything, Ren Calloway allowed herself to feel the full weight of what she had just done. Not regret, not fear specifically. Something heavier and more complicated, the gravity of a person who has placed everything on the table and is now waiting to see what the world does with it. Harlan Voss, national enforcer. The man that Hollow Creek crossed the street to avoid looked at a 23-year-old woman in a diner apron who had not crossed the street, who had not run for the back door, who had poured his coffee and stood her ground, and handed him the most dangerous truth she owned. And he said simply, "You've got guts. I'll give you that." "I've got a brother," Ren said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. but it gets you to the same place. Outside, the late afternoon sun was beginning to flatten against the desert. The heat was shifting, not cooling, not yet, but moving, changing quality. The way Arizona heat behaves in the hour before dusk, when the sky begins to go colors that don't have names in other parts of the country, and the air loses its worst edge and becomes something you can almost make peace with. Inside the diner, Gus Farrell stood in the kitchen and breathed slowly and said nothing at all, which was the wisest thing he could do, and he knew it. Inside the diner, 40 men who had not recently been surprised by anything looked at a girl in an apron and found they had no category for her. Wren picked up the coffee pot. She topped off Harlan's mug. Then she looked at him and asked the most ordinary questions she could think of, because ordinary questions were what she had, and they had gotten her this far. "You want anything to eat?" He blinked. Then he laughed. It was brief and low and real. The laugh of a man who has been handed something he was not expecting and doesn't quite know what else to do with it. "Yeah," he said. "Burger. Whatever you've got." She wrote it down. She turned to the pickup window, and she called out in the same voice she used every single day of her working life, "Gus. One burger. And don't burn it." A pause from the kitchen. Then Gus's voice, slightly unsteady, slightly lower than usual. "Coming right up." Wren stood behind their counter of her diner, surrounded by 40 of the most feared men in the American Southwest. And she did what she had been doing all day because it was what she knew how to do, and because her brother was alive somewhere in the dark, and she had just started the clock on bringing him home. She worked. The burger was half eaten when Harlan pushed the plate aside and looked at her again across the counter. "Walk me through the recordings," he said. "Everything you remember." She had been waiting for this. Not in the anxious way of someone who has been dreading a test, but in the focused way of someone who has been preparing for the only opportunity they're going to get and intends to use it exactly right. She pulled a stool from behind the counter and sat down across from him, because this was going to take time and standing would be performance, and she was done performing. 6 weeks after Colt disappeared, she said, "I went through his room for what was probably the fourth time, not looking for anything specific anymore, just unable to stop looking." Grief does that. It makes you repeat certain motions because the repetition feels like action, and action feels like not giving up. She paused. "I pulled his old work boots out of the back of his closet. The left one felt wrong, too heavy." She watched Harlan's expression shift slightly. "I reached inside," she said, "found a small digital recorder wrapped in electrical tape, the kind you can get at any hardware store for $20. Briggs, who had been quiet for some time, set down his coffee mug very slowly. 11 recordings. Wren continued. The first 3 were short. Dates, locations, logistics. The dry language of someone documenting a situation because they need a record of it. But starting with the 4th, his voice changed. She didn't look away from Harlan. He was alone. I could tell from the acoustics. And he was scared, not panicked. Colt was never a man who panicked, but scared in the deliberate, controlled way of someone who has looked at the road ahead and understood that it doesn't go anywhere good. She recalled the specific words without effort. She had listened to them so many times that they had become part of her internal architecture, not memorized but absorbed. He said she told them, "If something happens to me, it wasn't them. It was someone inside. Someone with a patch and a handshake and a face I trusted." The room received this in silence. Harlan's jaw had tightened. Something had changed in the angle of his head, not much but enough. Wren continued. She described the meeting Colt had documented. 3 weeks before he vanished, a man had come to him alone, not through the club, not with any authorization, and offered him a way out. Told him the federal heat was coming. Told him the operation was burned. Said the smart move was to take what they'd gathered and hand it to a specific federal agent who could make everything disappear. Said it had already been cleared with leadership, Wren said. Harlan's expression didn't change, but the stillness that came over him was a different quality of stillness than before. It hadn't been cleared, Wren said, because Colt called someone higher up that same night to confirm, and that person had no idea what he was talking about. which meant the man who came to him was freelancing, running his own play. She paused. And when Colt figured that out, and when the man realized Colt had figured it out, that's when everything went wrong. Briggs said quietly, "Who did he call higher up?" "He didn't say the name on the recording," Wren said. "He just said the old man." "I don't know who that is." Harlan and Briggs exchanged a look. Something passed between them, a specific weight she couldn't fully decode, but she felt it. It answered something. Some question that had been hanging open between them for longer than tonight. "The federal agent," Harlan said. "The one the man wanted Colt to hand the evidence to. Did Colt name him?" "He said a name," Wren said. "Conrad Fay." The reaction was immediate and physical. Two of the men near the window straightened. Somewhere behind her, a sound, not quite a word, not quite a breath. Briggs turned his face toward the wall for a moment, the deliberate movement of a man who needs somewhere to put his eyes that isn't the center of the room. Harlan did not move. But the stillness that came over him was the absolute zero stillness of a man processing something at a speed his body cannot match. Not calm. Something the opposite of calm that had disciplined itself into perfect external quiet. "You know that name," Wren said. "Yeah," Harlan said very quietly. "We know that name. Tell me." He looked at her for a moment. Then he did. Conrad Fay had been running an operation out of the Nevada field office for 3 years. Officially a joint task force targeting trafficking routes. Unofficially, Harlan stopped. Chose his next words with the care of a man who does not say things he doesn't mean. Unofficially, Fay stopped caring about stopping crime somewhere around the end of the first year. What he cared about after that was becoming wealthy off of it. He steals cartel money. He engineers evidence. He controls which informants get burned and when. He has been running this for years, and every time someone has gotten close, that someone has disappeared or discredited themselves or ended up somewhere that conversations about them use the past tense. He looked at her steadily. "That's where Colt is," Wren said. It wasn't a question. "We don't know that. But you think it." He didn't answer, which was its own answer. She put her hands flat on the counter. She needed something solid. The wood of the countertop under her palms, the familiar tilt of it, the scratch that Colt had made 2 inches from her left hand. "The recordings prove it," she said. "They prove Colt was feeding you legitimate intelligence. They prove he was set up by someone inside who handed him to Fay. If we go public." "You can't go public with this," Harlan said, the first sharp thing he'd said all evening. She looked at him. "Why not?" "Because Fay has people in every newsroom that matters in this state. Because the moment those recordings surface publicly, they become evidence in a federal investigation that Fay controls. He'll have them sealed. He'll bury the chain of custody. He'll make the person who handed them over into a witness in a case that will never reach a courtroom." He leaned forward slightly. "And then you become a problem he needs to solve." She held his eyes. "So what do we do?" "We find the recordings first. All copies. We verify them ourselves. And then we find out who inside our organization sold your brother to that man." "You already have a suspect," Wren said. She watched his face. He didn't deny it. She had been watching faces across counters for 7 years. She knew what someone looked like when they were carrying a name they hadn't said out loud yet. "You've been thinking about someone this whole conversation," she said. "I can see it." From somewhere down the counter, Briggs made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a warning. Something in between. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. "You're perceptive," he said. "I've been working tables since I was 16, Wren said. "You learn to read people." He was quiet. Then he said, "There's a man, a captain, 14 years with the club. His name is Dutch Mercer." The name dropped into the conversation, and something shifted. Not in the loud, dramatic way that things shift in the stories people tell later, but in the quiet, irreversible way of actual change. Several of the men near the back went still in a way that was different from how they'd been still before. This was the stillness of people who have just heard something said aloud that has previously only existed as a thought, the discomfort of a secret becoming a sentence. "We call him Dutch," Briggs said, and his voice held something she hadn't heard from him before, something rougher, lower. Something that sounded like it had been stored for a long time in a place that wasn't good for it. "He trained," Colt Wren said slowly. The recordings came back to her. Colt's voice warm and specific, talking about the man who had shown him the ropes, who had eaten dinner with him, who had vouched for him. She hadn't known the name then. She knew it now, and the knowing of it rearranged something in the room that she would not be able to put back. "He trained my brother," she said again. "Yes," Harlan said. "And you think he's the one?" "I've thought it for 2 months," Harlan said. "I don't have proof, just a feeling and a few things that don't add up." A feeling in this business, though, he paused, a feeling in this business can keep you alive long enough to find the proof. He looked at her. The voice on the recordings, the man who came to Colt. Is there anything specific, any phrase, any way he spoke that you remember clearly? She closed her eyes. She had listened to those recordings so many times that she could play them back internally with almost perfect fidelity. The rhythm of Colt's breathing, the way his voice dropped when he was being most careful, the specific silence before certain sentences that told her more than the words themselves. She opened her eyes. He said, "The man who came to Colt said, 'This is the cleanest exit you're going to get, brother. The highway's closing.'" The silence that followed was different from every silence that had come before it in this room on this evening. Different because it wasn't empty. It was full of something arriving, something that had been in transit for a long time and had just pulled into the station. Briggs had turned back toward her. His face had gone a color she didn't like. Harlan's hand resting on the counter had curled slowly and without apparent intention into a fist. "That's a phrase," Wren said carefully. "Isn't it? That's something specific. Dutch uses that phrase," Harlan said. Very quietly. "He's used it for years. It's his." He looked up at her. "You just confirmed something I've been trying to confirm for 60 days. She felt something move through her. Not triumph. There was nothing here that felt like winning. More like the nauseating lurch of something enormous beginning to move. A boulder that has been balanced on a ledge finally tipping past the point where balance is possible. "He's going to know," she said, "when word gets out that I came here, that I talked to you. He'll know what it means." "Yes," Harlan said. "How long before?" "Not long." He looked at Briggs. Something passed between them, quick, decisive, the full conversation compressed into 2 seconds of eye contact. Then he looked back at her. "Where are the recordings?" "My apartment. Hidden. You need to not be at your apartment tonight." "I understand that. Is there anyone at all who knew you were planning to approach us today?" She thought about it, honestly and carefully, the way the question deserved. "No," she said. "I didn't tell anyone. I barely admitted it to myself until this morning." He nodded. "Good. That buys us a few hours." He stood up from the stool, all 6'3" of him rising in a single motion, and he looked down at her with an expression she couldn't fully categorize. It was the expression of a man who has been surprised by something and hasn't finished deciding how he feels about being surprised, and is setting that unfinished decision aside for later because there is no time for it now. "You're going to come with us tonight," he said. "You're going to retrieve the recordings from your apartment, and then we're going to listen to all of them together. Every word. And then what she said. And then we're going to find out exactly where Conrad Fay is keeping your brother." She stood up from the stool. She untied her apron. She folded it and set it on the counter with a care that was out of proportion to the object, the care of someone performing a small, ordinary gesture as a stand-in for a much larger one. A way of saying, without saying it, that some version of her normal life was being set down here on this counter next to Colt's scratch in the wood, and she didn't know when she would pick it back up again. Gus appeared in the pickup window. He looked at her. He looked at Harlan. He looked back at her. His face held the expression of a man who has 14 things he wants to say and has correctly identified that none of them are useful. "Lock up when you're done, Gus," she said. He caught himself before saying the wrong name. "Wren. I'll call you tomorrow. You don't have to do this. I know I don't have to, she said. She looked at him. Good, careful, frightened Gus, who had worked beside her for 4 years and who had never once in 4 years let her down in any way that mattered. And she let him see in her face that she was not being reckless, that she had thought about this, that she understood what she was walking toward and was walking toward it anyway. I know exactly what I'm doing. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded. Once. And his face arranged itself into something that was not acceptance, but was close to it, the look of a man who loves someone enough to let them make the hard choice without making them carry his fear alongside their own. You call me, he said, the second you can. First thing she said. They left the diner together, her surrounded by 40 Hell's Angels, walking out into the desert evening. The sky was going red and gold above the flat horizon. The air had finally begun to give up some of its heat, that hour before dusk reprieve that felt like a concession the desert was making grudgingly on its own terms. She heard one of the younger men, 25 maybe, with the kind of face that hadn't yet decided what it was going to be, say quietly to the man beside him, "Who is she?" And she heard the answer equally quiet. "Colt Calloway's sister." A pause. "She coming with us?" "Apparently she's not afraid." A longer pause. "I don't think afraid is something she does." She didn't turn toward it. She didn't acknowledge it. She kept walking toward the line of motorcycles in the gravel lot, toward whatever was going to happen next, toward the Nevada dark, where her brother was waiting in a room without windows. But she felt it. The shift. The subtle but unmistakable rearrangement of how 40 men were moving around her. The way presence adjusts itself when it encounters something it has to account for. She had walked into a room full of the most feared men in the American Southwest and poured them coffee and told them the truth. And they had listened. The rest was just what came next. They retrieved the recordings from her apartment in under 10 minutes. She knew exactly where they were inside the lining of Colt's old leather jacket, which she kept hanging on the back of her bedroom door, because taking it down felt too much like admitting something she wasn't prepared to admit. She reached into the lining through a small seam she'd carefully reopened and restitched 3 times in 6 months of moving the recorder in and out, and she pulled out the digital device and the USB backup drive she'd made in the second week. And she held them in her palm for a moment before handing them over. Harlan took them. He held the recorder in his large hand and looked at it, this small, unremarkable piece of hardware wrapped in electrical tape, the kind of object that cost $20 and contained everything. He planned for this, Harlan said. Not to her specifically, more to the air above his hand. He planned for everything, Wren said. Even as a kid, had a plan B and a plan C before most people had finished thinking about plan A. It used to drive me crazy. Her voice caught slightly on the last sentence. Just slightly. She pulled it back. He planned for the possibility that he wouldn't make it out, Harlan said. Yes, he planned for someone to look. He planned for me. Harlan looked at her. Something moved in his expression that she didn't try to name. They listened to the recordings in the back of a reinforced van parked 3 miles outside of Hollow Creek. All 11 of them beginning to end in the order Colt had made them. No one spoke during the playback. Wren had heard them so many times that she could have recited them word for word, but she listened again anyway, because listening in this space surrounded by these men, with the desert dark pressing against the van's windows, was a different experience than listening alone in her apartment at 2 in the morning with the volume low so the neighbors wouldn't hear. She watched their faces, or tried to in the low light that came from a single fixture mounted above the rear doors. What she saw there was not what she had expected to see. She had expected the hard calculation of men assessing tactical information, the cold professional processing of intelligence that could be used. And that was there. But underneath it, and around it, and running through it like a current through wire, was something older than calculation. Something that looked in the low light of that van very much like grief. These men had known Colt Calloway, had trusted him, had in their way and by their code considered him one of their own. And they were now listening to his voice recorded months ago in a room he'd been alone in, scared but deliberate, documenting betrayal with the methodical calm of someone who understood that the record might matter more than the person making it, and the listening was costing them something. She had not expected that. She didn't know what to do with it, so she filed it away and kept watching. When the final recording ended, the van held its silence for a full 30 seconds. No one moved. The desert outside was absolute and still. Then one of the men near the front, a large, quiet man who had not said a single word all evening, whose face in the dim light had the quality of someone who processes things slowly and completely rather than quickly and partially, said, "That's Dutch's voice." "Yeah," said the man beside him. The first man said it again. "That's Dutch's voice." Louder. Not because he needed to be louder, but because the statement required more weight the second time. Because the first time was identification, and the second time was confirmation. And confirmation is a different thing entirely. Harlan said nothing. He was looking at the recorder in his hand. His expression was the expression of a man who has watched something he half believed become fully irreversibly real, and who is now standing on the other side of that moment in the territory where doubt is no longer a country he can return to, where only action remains as a destination. He looked up. He looked at Wren. "Dutch rode out of camp this morning," he said. "Said he had business in Nevada." She felt the implication of that move through her like cold water finding its level. "He knows," she said, "maybe not the specifics, but he sensed something. He's been with us 14 years. You don't survive 14 years without developing an instinct for when the temperature in a room has changed." He paused. "He has a contact in Faye's operation. If he's already made a call, then Faye knows about the recordings," Wren said. "Then Faye knows about you," Harlan said. She absorbed that. She turned it over. She looked at it from every angle she could find in the time available, and every angle converged on the same point. "Then we don't have time," she said. "No," he agreed. And there was something in his voice now that hadn't been there before. A hard, flat urgency that lived below strategy, in the place where men like him kept the things they didn't discuss, but always carried. "That's why we moved tonight." She looked around the van. At 40 faces in various stages of the same expression, the look of men who have been handed something true and have already moved past the question of whether they believe it and into the question of what happens next. The look of people for whom decision and action are not separated by much distance. "What do you need from me?" she said. Harlan looked at her for a moment. "You know these recordings better than anyone here. You've been living with them for weeks. There are details in them, locations, distances, references that might mean nothing in isolation, but mean something when we're looking at the right map." He paused. "I need you thinking all night. Whatever Colt said that you haven't told us yet, I need all of it." "Okay," she said. He held her gaze. "And I need you to understand something." His voice dropped. Not softer, more direct. The editing gone out of it. "Where we're going, it won't be a polite conversation. There won't be negotiating. No legal framework that applies to what we do when we find the man who sold your brother." He stopped. Corrected. "When we find your brother." She met his eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. "I know," she said. "You're still in." "My brother is alive in a hole in the ground," she said. "I'm not going home to wait." He looked at her one more time. That evaluating look. The look of a man who keeps encountering the same person and finding her different than his last assessment required. Then the van began to move. They were 40 miles outside of Hollow Creek when the first SUV appeared. Wren was in the rear of the van with Briggs and two men she hadn't been introduced to. Men who spoke to each other in the shorthand of people who have operated together for years, in partial sentences and small gestures that carried full conversations inside them. She had been running the recordings through her mind, pulling at threads, trying to extract anything she'd heard, but not fully processed. A road number Colt had mentioned in passing. A reference to a water tower visible from the access point. Something about distance from a state line that she hadn't been able to place on any map she'd found. She almost missed it when Briggs's phone buzzed, and he looked at the screen and his face changed. "We've got a tail," he said. Flat, operational. The tone of a man reporting a fact, not a crisis. The driver, a compact man with close-cropped hair and the stillness of someone trained to keep his body quiet when his mind is running hard, adjusted his mirror without turning his head. How many? One confirmed. Probably more running parallel. Federal plates clean. No markings. Briggs looked at Wren. "You told nobody tonight. You're certain?" "I'm certain," she said. Then Dutch already called it in. He picked up the radio. "Harlan." The response came back immediately. Harlan's voice through the static, steady clipped already ahead of the question. "I see it. Two more running parallel on the Northern Service Road. They've been pacing us for 6 minutes. Coordinated," the driver said quietly. "That's not surveillance," Briggs said. "That's positioning." She understood what that meant before he finished the sentence. They weren't being followed. They were being funneled. Someone had set a perimeter while they were still in the van, listening to recordings, while she was still sitting in her own apartment, reaching into the lining of her brother's jacket. The machinery had already been moving. Conrad Fay hadn't waited to find out exactly what she knew. He'd made a decision the moment Dutch called, and the decision was not to negotiate. "They're going to cut us off on the road," she said. Briggs looked at her. "Smart. What do we do?" "We don't stop moving." He keyed the radio again. "Harlan, we're 4 minutes from the Ridge Creek Junction. If they want to box us in, that's where they'll do it." "Agreed." Harlan's voice came back. "Change of plan. We don't go to the secondary location. We need solid walls and single road access." A pause, 1 second, 2. "The diner," Wren said. Harlan's voice. "Can you get us in?" "I have keys," she said. "Then we go back. Now." The van turned hard. She grabbed the door handle and held on. Around them, through the thin metal walls, she could hear the convoy adjusting, the sound of 40 motorcycle engines changing direction, simultaneously, a sound that should not have been as coordinated as it was, but was because 40 men who have ridden together for years develop a responsiveness to each other that operates below the level of explicit communication. Behind them, the SUVs accelerated, no longer maintaining distance, no longer performing the careful spacing of vehicles that don't want to be identified. They were moving now with the directness of machines that have been given permission to stop pretending. She heard the engine note change through the van's walls. Higher, harder, the sound of pursuit that has stopped being subtle. They made it back to Hollow Creek in 11 minutes. She had the keys out before the van stopped moving. She was through the diner door, and the next breath Harlan right behind her, the rest of the men flowing in around and through her, with the fluid efficiency of water finding its level. She heard the deadbolts going across both of them, the front and the side entrance. She heard the crash of a booth being turned on its side and dragged to reinforce the front door. She heard Harlan's voice cutting through the noise, controlled and absolutely certain of itself, placing men at specific windows, specific positions along the walls, a different voice than the one that had sat at her counter and asked for a burger. Harder, faster. The voice of a man who has trained for exactly this contingency and is now in the part of the evening where the training ends and the reality begins. "How many are we looking at?" someone called from the window. "Minimum 12 vehicles. Could be 20 men, could be more." A voice from the front. "They're not in uniform." "No badges, no lights," Harlan said. "These aren't law enforcement. These are Fay's private contractors. He's been running them out of a black budget account for 2 years. He looked at Wren. "Stay away from the windows. I know my diner," she said. "The walk-in cooler has no exterior walls. It's the safest. I'm not hiding in the cooler." He looked at her. There was no time for the conversation that look implied. He knew it and she knew it. "Fine," he said. "Stay low and stay useful." The first shot came through the front window 40 seconds later. Not a warning shot, not a signal. A direct, deliberate shot that punched through the glass and buried itself in the back wall 6 inches above Gus's pickup window. She heard the glass come down, not shattering in the dramatic way glass shatters in films, but falling, the heavy cascade of safety glass, releasing from a frame a sound that was almost gentle and was the opposite of gentle. She pressed herself against the inside wall beside the counter, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her by its sharpness, "This is real. This is actually happening." This is the thing she had been told her whole life that girls like her didn't walk into. Then she stopped thinking about what it was and started thinking about what was useful. She turned to Briggs, who was crouched 2 feet away from her with his back against the counter base. "The roof access," she said. "Above the kitchen there's a hatch. From up there you can see the entire access road and the parking lot. Full sight lines." He looked at her sharply. "You're sure?" "I've been up there 100 times to service the ventilation unit. You can see everything." He didn't hesitate. 2 men were moving toward the kitchen within 4 seconds. More shots came. Controlled, targeted, the kind of fire designed to keep heads down rather than to eliminate, which told her something. They weren't trying to destroy everyone inside. They were applying pressure, creating a situation, funneling someone she understood toward a specific outcome. "They want me outside," she said to Harlan, who had moved to the wall beside her. Yes, standard playbook: create enough pressure that the people inside push the vulnerable person out to stop the escalation. "They expect us to protect you by handing you over." He said it without apology. "That's the calculation they're running." She looked at him. "The USB drive. Ward, can he move?" Harlan looked across the room. Ward was 24 slight, with the quick physical intelligence of someone who had spent his life navigating spaces that weren't designed for comfort. He was already looking at Harlan with the expression of someone waiting for the right question. "There's a crawl space," Wren said, "under the east side of the building. It connects to a drainage culvert that runs parallel to the main road. You'd have to go one at a time, but it comes out behind the gas station 200 yards north." Harlan was already looking at Ward. Ward was already nodding. She pulled the USB drive from her pocket. She had been carrying it against her palm since the van, a habit she'd developed in the weeks since she'd made the backup. The same way you carry something you're afraid of losing. Not in a bag, not in a pocket you can't monitor, but in your hand where you can feel it at all times. She crossed to Ward. She showed him the crawlspace access behind the dishwasher unit. She described the route, the distance, the exit point. He listened with the complete, unadorned focus of someone for whom information is equipment. He took the drive. He looked at her once, direct, serious, the look of a person accepting a responsibility and meaning it. And then he was gone, moving through the kitchen with a quietness that didn't match his speed. She turned back to Harlan. "That's the backup," she said. "Now tell me the real plan." He looked at her. "We've been doing what Faye expects," he said. "Defending, holding ground, going reactive." He paused. "I don't like playing defense. What are you saying?" "I'm saying that while his people are focused on this building, they're not focused on their vehicles. And unattended vehicles have a way of becoming significant problems for the people who own them." He looked past her at Briggs. "We go out the north side, 6 men. We move around the perimeter while they're still positioning for the 2-point entry. We disable their transport. We cut their communications. And suddenly 20 contractors who were hunting us are 20 contractors standing in the Arizona desert with no ride and no way to call for backup." She thought about it. Not long. There wasn't time for long. "They're not expecting it," she said. "They came here to lay siege," Harlan said. "They didn't come expecting us to come to them. They made the mistake of thinking we'd be afraid." She felt something shift in the room when he said it. Something collective, a current moving through the men around her, a shared recognition that passed from person to person without anyone speaking it aloud. The electricity of people who have decided together at the same moment not to be frightened anymore. 30 seconds, Harlan said. "North side. Briggs, you're with me." He looked at Wren one final time. "Stay inside. Stay down. If anyone comes through any door in the next 15 minutes and it's not one of us, I'll know what to do," she said. Something moved in his face. Not a smile. The shape of one without committing. "I believe you," he said. They went out the north side into the dark. What happened in the next 12 minutes she pieced together afterward. She could only directly witness the part that happened inside the diner, the sounds that came through the walls, and what those sounds told her about what was happening outside them. She heard distant shouts, The crunch of something heavy connecting with metal, a car alarm screaming to life and then cutting off abruptly mid-note. She heard the pattern of gunfire change, heard it become confused, heard the controlled aggression of phase contractors dissolve into the disorganized reaction of people who no longer understood where the threat was coming from. She heard someone outside give an order that was immediately countermanded by someone else. She heard very clearly, through the east wall, the repeated mechanical protests of vehicles that would not start. And then she heard something she hadn't anticipated. She heard Harlan's voice close just outside the north door. "We've got one. Bring him in." The door opened. They brought in a man she'd never seen, 30s, tactical clothing, a cut on his temple from something that had connected with it recently, with considerable authority. His hands were secured behind him. He was not in a condition to resist meaningfully, but he was attempting it anyway, which she supposed said something about him even if she wasn't sure what. Harlan crouched in front of him. "Conrad Fay," he said. "Where is he running the operation from?" The man said nothing. "I'll ask," once more Harlan said. His voice had not raised. If anything, it had gotten quieter, and that quiet was considerably more frightening than volume would have been. Silence. Briggs stepped forward from the wall. The man looked at Briggs. Something happened in his eyes, a rapid calculation, the assessment of a professional evaluating a situation and arriving at a conclusion about his options. "I want immunity," the man said, "in writing, before I say a single word." "You're not in a position to negotiate," Harlan said. "Neither are you." The man's voice was controlled, but she could hear the effort the control was costing him. His breathing was wrong, 2 beats too fast, the respiration of someone running on adrenaline and bad odds. "You've got maybe 20 minutes before Faye sends a second team. One I'm not part of. One with federal warrants already filled in with your names." He paused. "You need what I know more than you need to be right about this conversation." A silence. So he said, "Immunity and a road out of the state. That's my offer." Harlan looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, "Talk first. Document after. That's what I have." "That's not—" "It's what I have," Harlan said. "And I keep my word. Ask anyone in this room." The man looked around. He took in the faces around him, the faces of men who had spent their adult lives outside the system. This contractor had been paid to operate within, who had survived out there for a long time by operating on a code that was severe but consistent. She watched him do the math. She watched him arrive at the same place she had arrived at that afternoon when she'd walked up to Harlan's stool and poured his coffee. Sometimes the most reliable person in the room is not the one with the credentials. "Faye is at the site," the man said. "Has been for 3 days. He knows you found the recordings." He looked at Wren, a brief assessing look, and then away. "He knows about the girl. He moved the prisoner 2 nights ago." He continued, "Deeper into the facility, there's a substructure below the main bunker floor. Rooms that don't appear on any official layout. Rooms that officially don't exist." He stopped. "The man you're looking for is in the 3rd room on the left. He was alive 48 hours ago." Another pause. "That's all I can confirm." The room went very still. She heard the words, "he was alive 48 hours ago," and she felt them arrive in the center of her chest, like the first real breath after a long time underwater. She had been holding herself at a functional distance from the full reality of it for 6 months. The way you hold a wound shut with your own hands while you wait for help, because looking at it directly might cost you the ability to keep the pressure on. Colt was in a room below the Nevada desert floor. He was alive. He was waiting. 48 hours ago, he was alive. She pressed her hands flat against the counter behind her. She needed the wood under her palms, the familiar tilt of it. She found the scratch without looking for it, she always did, and pressed her thumb into the groove of it and breathed. "Coordinates," Harlan said to the man. Flat and immediate, the man gave them. Harlan stood. He looked across the wrecked interior of the diner, the overturned booth, the glass on the floor, the front window gone, the ceiling fan still marking time on every 3rd rotation, because some mechanisms simply continue regardless of what is happening around them. He looked at Wren. She saw in his face what she felt in her chest. Not hope. Hope was too fragile a word, too provisional, too dependent on things going right. This was something more structural than hope. This was certainty beginning to take shape. The moment before action, when everything that has been abstract and terrible and theoretical becomes navigable and real. We move in 2 hours, he said, before the second team deploys. He looked around the room. Everyone rests. Everyone reloads. We roll at 0200. Then he looked back at her. You should eat something. She almost laughed. The specific absurdity of it, standing in her shot-up diner at 1 in the morning surrounded by 40 Hells Angels and a bound federal contractor being told to eat something. You're telling me to eat, she said. You haven't eaten since this morning. He said it matter-of-factly. Where we're going tonight, you need everything you've got. She looked around the diner, at the chaos phase people had made of the space she had worked in for years. At Gus's pickup window still intact, the small order-up bell still sitting on the ledge where it always sat. She thought about Gus at home by now, unable to sleep, keeping his phone charged and close to him. She walked behind the counter. She turned on the grill. She started cooking. Not because she wasn't afraid, not because any part of this felt manageable or ordinary, but because Colt was alive 48 hours ago, and she was going to be in a van heading toward Nevada in 2 hours, and between now and then, the most useful thing she could do was keep moving, keep her hands occupied, keep the engine running on whatever was fueling her through this night. She made food for 40 men in a diner with no front window in the middle of the Arizona dark. Not one of them commented on it. They just ate. There was something in that which she would think about later in the quieter days that followed. The specific dignity of it. The way those men accepted what she offered without making it into something sentimental or significant. The way they accepted the food, the way they accepted everything else she had done that night as a fact of who she was, not as a remarkable deviation from who they expected her to be. She brought Harlan a plate without being asked. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked up the fork. The second team, she said, sitting down across from him. How long do we actually have? Long enough, he said. Dutch doesn't know we have the contractor. He doesn't know we have the coordinates. As far as Faye knows right now, we're still pinned inside this building, waiting for the situation to resolve. He ate a bite, set the fork down. He thinks we're afraid, she said. He thinks we're contained, Harlan said, which is what afraid looks like from the outside. She thought about that. Tell me about the bunker, she said. What are we walking into? He was quiet for a moment, not reluctant, preparing. The silence of a man who is selecting what to say and how to say it, not because he wants to protect her from the information, but because precision matters. Decommissioned military installation, he said. Off the federal books for 15 years officially. Faye has been using it unofficially for 3. He runs interrogations there. Evidence storage. It's where he processes everything he takes from the operations he burns. He paused. It won't be a clean building, Wren. She understood what he meant. She didn't ask him to clarify. How many people has he held there? We don't know exactly. He looked at his plate. Enough. And Dutch, she said, if he's there, he'll be with Faye. Dutch knows we're coming now. He ran to the only protection available. He looked up at her. When we find him, let me handle it. Okay, she said. He held her eyes for a moment longer, reading her the same way she had been reading rooms her whole working life. She let him look. She had nothing to conceal. What she was feeling was visible, and she wasn't trying to manage it. You've been carrying this alone for 6 months, he said. Yes. No one in this town helped you. People were scared. She said it without judgment. I understand it. This town learned a long time ago that making noise about certain things is expensive. Colt understood it too. He just decided it wasn't a good enough reason to stay quiet. She paused. He told me once that he was tired of watching people with authority treat it like a private account. He said someone had to be the friction. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then he said that to me too, almost exactly those words. He looked at her steadily. He's a good man. Present tense. Deliberate. He, as Ren said. Same tense. Same deliberateness. They sat in a silence that had nothing uncomfortable in it, which surprised her. Two people in a damaged diner at 1 in the morning with the desert outside, and Nevada somewhere beyond it, in a room below the ground, somewhere in that dark with her brother in it. And the silence between them needed nothing added to it. At 1:45, Harlan stood. He moved to the center of the diner and spoke to the room with a quiet authority that required no volume to carry its weight. 5 minutes. The room transformed. Men who had been resting against walls and in booths moved with the immediate practiced efficiency of people who have been in this transition many times. Equipment was checked. The specific quiet sounds of preparation filled the space, methodical, purposeful, without the charged drama that films attach to such moments. This was work. It looked like work looks. Ren washed the last plate and set it on the drying rack. She dried her hands on a clean towel and folded it and set it on the counter next to Gus's bell. She took her jacket from the hook by the kitchen door. Harlan appeared at her side. "Whatever we find in there," he said, "whatever condition he's in, you remember what I said earlier. It still applies, more now than it did then." She looked at him. "We go in knowing he's there," Harlan said. "That's the only fact we carry. Everything else is details we handle when we get to them." She nodded. Her throat did the thing it did sometimes now, the sudden tightening that arrived without permission, and she managed it the way she'd been managing it for 6 months, which was to acknowledge it and continue. She continued. They left through the north door into the Arizona night. The air had gone cool the way desert air goes cool after midnight, not gradually but suddenly, as if the temperature had been waiting for permission. The sky above Hollow Creek was enormous and clear and indifferent, the stars doing what stars do over the desert, which is exist in a quantity that reminds you of the scale of things. 40 motorcycles started up around her, one then another then the rest, until the night was nothing but sound and forward motion. She got into the van. She sat down. She put her hands in her lap. Colt had put a recorder in a boot and trusted that someone who loved him would be stubborn enough to find it. He had done the thing that needed doing, even knowing what it might cost him, because someone had to be the friction. She understood that now in a way she hadn't when she'd first heard the phrase on the recording. She understood it the way you understand something when you've done the equivalent yourself, when you've walked up to 40 men and told them the truth, because it was the only move that led anywhere worth going. The van moved. The convoy moved around it. The lights of Hollow Creek fell away behind them and the desert opened up ahead, vast and dark, and crossed by a road that led northwest toward Nevada, toward a decommissioned building that didn't exist on official maps, toward the third room on the left at the bottom of 14 stairs. She pressed her thumb into her palm. She breathed. She was still afraid. She had not stopped being afraid since she heard the first engine in the distance that afternoon. But she had learned something in the past several hours that she suspected she would spend a long time understanding in its full dimensions. Fear was not the opposite of action. Fear was just the cost of it. You paid the cost, and you kept moving, and the moving was the point. And the point was Colt, and Colt was alive 48 hours ago. The convoy ran without headlights. The desert received them. The night held everything it was holding. She closed her eyes and went through the recordings one more time, pulling at every thread she could find. Road numbers, distances. The way Colt's voice had sounded in the 7th recording when he talked about Dutch not angry, which she might have expected, but sad. The specific sadness of a person who trusted someone completely and is now sitting alone in a room making a recording because the trust turned out to be the most dangerous thing he carried. She had spent 6 months becoming the friction. In 2 hours, she would find out what that cost and what it was worth. Outside the van windows, the Arizona dark gave way by degrees to the dark of Nevada, and the stars moved overhead, the way stars move when you're traveling fast beneath them, and the road went on, and she went with it. The convoy stopped on a stretch of road that existed on no map Ren had ever seen. Not because the road was hidden, it was simply unremarkable enough to have been forgotten. The kind of path that forms when enough vehicles have crossed the same ground enough times that the desert stops resisting and accepts the impression. No signs, no markers, just compacted earth running northwest between two low ridgelines that blocked the horizon and made the sky feel closer than it was. Harlan came to the van door. A quarter mile out, he said, "From here we go on foot." She climbed out. The night air at this elevation had a different quality than the Arizona dark they'd left behind, thinner, colder, with a clarity that made the stars look recently placed. She could see the ridgelines as slightly darker shapes against the sky, and between them nothing visible. No light, no structure, nothing that announced itself. "You stay with Briggs," Harlan said. "You do not move independently. You do not make decisions without clearing them with one of us." He looked at her. "This is not negotiable." "Understood," she said. "Ren." She waited. "Whatever we find in there, you hold yourself together until we're out. Whatever it looks like. Whatever it costs. You hold until we're clear of the building." She nodded. Her throat did the thing again, but she was practiced at this now. "He's in there," Harlan said. "We go in with that as the only fact that matters." They moved through the dark on foot. 40 men and one woman, and the silence of it was something she felt in her body rather than just heard. The suspension of that much collective intention, moving through that much open space and making almost no sound. She matched Briggs's pace. She watched where he placed his feet and placed hers in the same locations, following the logic of his path without needing to understand it consciously. The way you follow a guide through unfamiliar terrain when the destination is the only thing you're thinking about. The bunker entrance was not what she had imagined. She had pictured something deliberate, something that announced what it was: heavy doors, signage, the visual vocabulary of containment. What the advance team had located and relayed back was a utility shed approximately the size of a single-car garage, sitting in a depression between two rock formations, in a way that made it look like it had always been there and had never been worth investigating. The kind of structure the eye slides off of. The kind of thing you could drive past every day for years and never once stop to consider. The entry team went in 4 minutes ahead of the main group. Ren stood in the dark with Briggs and waited. She counted her own heartbeats without meaning to. Her mind found the small arithmetic of it, the way it finds small tasks when larger things are too large to hold directly. She got to 61 before she stopped. She listened to the desert at this hour, this far from any town. The silence here had its own texture, not the absence of sound, but the presence of something older, a frequency that lived in the space behind her ears. The silence of a landscape that had existed before everything that was about to happen in it and would exist long after. She thought about Colt, not in the managed, controlled way she had been thinking about him all night, mining the recordings for useful details. She thought about him the way she used to think about him before he disappeared without purpose or strategy. Just the simple, unguarded fact of him. His voice when he was tired. The way he laughed at things he found genuinely funny, which was different from the way he laughed when he was being polite. The habit he had of leaving cabinet doors open that she had spent years complaining about and would give a great deal to complain about again. The radio on Briggs's belt clicked twice. Entry teams in Briggs said, "We move." Inside the bunker, the space was larger than any exterior had suggested. She felt it before she could see it, the change in acoustics, the way sound moved differently when it had room to travel. The flat echo of concrete walls and low ceilings, and no soft surfaces anywhere to absorb what the air was carrying. It smelled like machinery and something older underneath, that something she identified without wanting to, and then set aside because there was no useful response to it. The lighting inside was sparse and functional, mounted strips along the ceiling at intervals, casting everything in a flat, colorless light that made distances harder to judge. Men moved in every direction with the coordinated purposefulness of a team that has practiced this type of entry enough times that individual decision-making has been compressed into something closer to instinct. She stayed with Briggs. She kept moving. They encountered the first resistance at the inner corridor, two of Faye's contractors, who had clearly been asleep and were now scrambling with the disoriented aggression of people pulled from sleep into a situation that had already moved past the point where their response could matter. The confrontation was brief, loud in a way that compressed itself into a very small window of time. And then it was over and she didn't process it because Briggs was already moving and her job was to keep up, and the keeping up was the only thing she had space for. The radio erupted, multiple voices, overlapping positions being called corridors, being designated the rapid shorthand of people coordinating in real time. Then Harlan's voice cutting through the others with the clarity of a voice people have learned to listen for. Faye is in the eastern wing. 4 men with him. He's moving toward the substructure access. A pause. Dutch is with him. Briggs looked at her. She looked back. Substructure, she said. That's where the rooms are, Briggs said. The ones the contractor described. She already knew this. She was already moving. The corridor they followed went down at a slight grade, barely perceptible, the kind of incline that announces itself only in the mild pressure it puts on the front of your feet. Fluorescent lights every 15 feet, one of them flickering at irregular intervals with no predictable rhythm, which was somehow worse than darkness would have been. She counted her steps. 47 before the corridor opened into a larger space, and she heard the voices. 2 of them. One was Harlan. She recognized it instantly, that particular low authority, the voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. The other was a voice she had never heard in person, but recognized anyway, in the specific way you recognize something you've been told about, in enough detail that the actual thing feels like confirmation rather than discovery. Dutch Mercer. She came around the corner into the space and she saw them. Harlan stood 15 feet from a man she had been carrying in her mind for weeks, as an abstraction, a name attached to a function, a voice on a recording, a collection of identifying details assembled from evidence. Now he was a physical fact, broad-shouldered gray at the temples with a Hell's Angels patch on his jacket that looked wrong in a way she understood immediately and completely. Not wrong because she objected to the patch itself wrong, the way a uniform looks wrong on someone who has betrayed the institution it represents. A costume without the conviction that makes it real. Dutch's face was the face of a man who had rehearsed several versions of this moment and was discovering that none of the rehearsals had adequately prepared him for the actual weight of it. Behind him, partly obscured, stood Conrad Fay. She had found a photograph of him during her months of searching a Federal Directory image official, and deliberately unremarkable. The kind of face designed to be forgettable in the specific way that people in certain positions learn to be forgettable. He didn't look forgettable now. He was older than the photograph, or the photograph had been taken before whatever he'd been doing for 3 years had finished arranging his face into what it currently was. Self-possessed bearing. The stillness of a man accustomed to being the most dangerous person in any given room and not accustomed to having that assessment challenged. His eyes found her across the space. She held his gaze for exactly a moment before turning back to what was happening between Harlan and Dutch. "Step away from the access door," Harlan said. His voice was the lowest she had heard it all night, stripped of everything except precision. Dutch didn't move. Harlan. His voice had a tremor in it that he was fighting and not entirely winning. "You're going to listen to me. 14 years, you owe me that conversation." "You sold a member of this club to a federal contractor," Harlan said. "You sat at our table, you ate our food, you slept under our roof and shook our hands while you were doing it." He paused. "You don't have 14 years. You have nothing." It wasn't. Dutch stopped. Started again. His jaw was working. It was a business decision. The operation was going sideways. Someone had to make the call, and I made it. "And his name was Colt Calloway," Harlan said. "Say his name." Silence. "Say his name," Harlan said again. The second time was quieter than the first. Quieter in the way that certain temperatures are colder than others, not in degree but in quality, in what they do to the things they touch. Dutch's jaw tightened. Something moved across his face. Not remorse. She was watching for remorse, and what she saw was not it. It was something adjacent to remorse, the shadow of it, the shape it leaves in a face that doesn't have access to the real thing. The expression of a man who has reached the end of his road and is processing that fact without the emotional equipment to process what it actually means. That was when he looked past Harlan and saw her. She hadn't meant to be visible. She had come around the corner with Briggs and stopped, and Briggs had positioned himself partially in front of her. But Dutch's eyes moved with the automatic efficiency of a man who has spent decades reading rooms for advantage, and they found her anyway. She watched the calculation happen on his face. Rapid, professional. The assessment of remaining options of what was still in his hand, of whether what was in his hand was enough. It happened fast, faster than the room could fully track. Dutch moved left around Harlan's outside using the half-second gap of Harlan's reaction time, the way a man uses a door that's closing, committed without hesitation. 4 steps. He covered the distance to Ren in 4 steps, and his hand closed around her arm, and she was in front of him before the room had finished processing the sequence, and the gun was at her head. Everything stopped. The specific crystallized stillness of a situation that has just become unnavigable by any normal set of rules. 40 men and Conrad Fay and the remaining contractors, all of them suspended in the sudden reconfiguration of the moment, all of the previous calculations voided, all of the trajectories redirected by 4 steps and a hand and a gun. Harlan had gone absolutely motionless. His eyes were on her face, not on Dutch, not on the gun on her face. And what she saw in his expression was something she had glimpsed throughout the night in brief flashes, but had not seen this clearly until now. The cost of allowing something to matter. The specific terrible exposure of a man who has spent years building walls between himself and that cost, and is now on the wrong side of them. "Let her go," Cole Harlan said. Cole, the given name, the name before the road name, the name from before whatever Dutch Mercer had been, before he became Dutch Mercer. "I walk out of here," Dutch said. His voice was not flat. It was the voice of a man playing his last card and fully aware of how thin it is. "I walk out with her. I get to a vehicle. I get distance. Then I let her go. That's the trade." "That's not a trade," Harlan said. "That's a request. Call it whatever you want." "If I let you walk out this door with her," Harlan said, "you don't let her go. You know that. I know that. Everyone in this room knows that. So the negotiation you're proposing doesn't exist." Dutch's grip on her arm tightened. She felt the pressure of it, the physical specificity of a frightened man's hand, the force of someone who has run out of good options and is holding on to the last bad one with everything he has left. She could feel his breathing against the side of her head. Fast and shallow, the respiration of someone whose body is running on adrenaline, and the kind of desperation that arrives when a person realizes that the story they've been telling themselves about how things would go has turned out to be wrong. She was afraid. She was genuinely, completely physically afraid, not in the managed, functional way she had been afraid all night, the fear that coexisted with action because she had no choice. This was the fear that arrives when you are no longer in control of what happens next, when the next moment has been taken out of your hands. And underneath the fear, something else was happening. She was thinking. She was thinking about 11 recordings on a $20 device wrapped in electrical tape. She was thinking about Colt's voice in the 7th recording when he talked about Dutch, not in anger, not in the tone of someone documenting betrayal for the record, but in the measured, sorrowful tone of someone who had known this person and was now trying to understand how knowing someone could fail to tell you the thing that mattered most about them. He'd said the thing about Dutch is that he telegraphs with his left hand. You want to know what he's actually doing, watch the hand he's not showing you. She looked at Dutch's right hand, the one holding the gun pressed against her temple, the hand the room was watching. She looked at his left hand, the one gripping her arm. His left hand was not pulling her toward the exit. It was pulling her slightly incrementally with the subtle direction of someone who is creating motion without appearing to create it toward the substructure access door. The open door, the one that led down. "He's not trying to escape," she said. Her voice was steadier than she expected, steadier than she felt. But the steadiness wasn't performance. It was the specific calm that arrives when you understand what is actually happening, and understanding gives you somewhere to put the fear. He's not trying to get out of the building. He needs something in those rooms. Dutch's grip on her arm changed. A small spasm of pressure there, and gone in under a second, but she felt it, and it confirmed what she had just said. Files, she said. She was working it out in real time, her voice level keeping Harlan in her peripheral vision. Evidence. Something he's been keeping down there that connects him to Faye as much as it connects Faye to him. He's not holding me hostage to walk out. He's holding me hostage to buy time to destroy something. She looked at Harlan directly. He's not trying to escape. He's trying to reach the substructure. Dutch's right hand, the gun hand, moved. Not much, not a deliberate reorientation. More like the instinctive physical response of a body whose attention has just been split between two things it cannot simultaneously manage. A fraction of a second in which the pressure of the gun at her temple shifted by 1.5 degrees. She dropped straight down. Not forward, not sideways. Straight down, knees hitting the concrete floor with a force that she would feel for the next 3 days, but did not feel in the moment, ducking completely out of his grip. In the single instant, his attention had fractured between her and the room, and the gun, and the collapsed architecture of everything he had been trying to hold together. The gunshot went high and wide. She heard it hit somewhere in the ceiling, heard the ceiling respond, pressed herself flat against the floor with her hands over her head, and held very still while the room above her resolved itself. It took less time than she would have expected. She heard Harlan move, felt the displacement of air that the coordinated movement of many people creates when they all commit to the same direction simultaneously. Heard a sequence of sounds that she did not try to individually identify. Heard Dutch's voice, once sharp, wordless, and then not again. When it was over, Briggs's hand was on her shoulder. Up, he said. You're okay. Up. She got up. Dutch was on the floor. Harlan stood over him. The gun was somewhere else. Dutch was not unconscious, but he was not going anywhere, held down by two men who were considerably larger than the situation required, using the excess as emphasis. On the far side of the room, Conrad Faye had his back against the wall. His composure, which had been remarkable throughout, the composure of a man who has spent years in situations where composure was the only currency that mattered, was showing its first real fractures. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, which had lost the certainty they'd carried when she first saw him. She could see it in his eyes, which were moving around the room with the rapid, recalculating quality of someone who has run every remaining option and keeps arriving at the same answer. He had no moves left. She walked across the room toward him. She was aware of the floor under her feet, of the fluorescent light above, of the specific quality of the air in this space. She stopped 6 feet from Conrad Faye, and she looked at him directly. He looked back at her. He was taller than his photograph had suggested. His face up close had the organized blankness of a man who has trained himself not to give things away and has been doing it for so long it has become structural. He said, I know who you are. I know who you are too, Ren said. A pause. Then he said in the measured tone of someone making a professional assessment, You're more capable than I accounted for. He said it without inflection. Not as a compliment, as a statement about his own miscalculation, the way a careful man notes a variable he failed to include. You forgot about Colt, she said. You controlled the information. You controlled the witnesses. You controlled the evidence and the systems that processed it. But you forgot that he planned for the possibility that he wouldn't make it out. And he planned specifically for me. She held his eyes. A man who records the truth and hides it in a boot isn't afraid of you, she said. He's afraid of you winning. Those are different things. And he made sure you wouldn't. Faye was quiet for a moment. He looked at her with the expression of a man encountering for the first time in a very long career a variable he had not known to account for. Not because the variable was beyond his intelligence, because it was beyond his imagination. He had built his operation on the assumption that people who were afraid stayed afraid, that people who were isolated stayed isolated, that the machinery of fear and silence was self-sustaining once properly set in motion. He had not accounted for a 23-year-old woman who poured coffee and told the truth. You already lost, she said. You just don't know it yet. He said nothing. He had made his calculation. The USB drive was outside this building. She saw the moment he arrived at this conclusion, the small, precise adjustment in his expression that told her he had just confirmed what he'd suspected since the lights went out on his contractor vehicles. Ward had gotten clear. The evidence was beyond phase reach now. Resistance was addition of charges without alteration of outcome. He put his hands up. It was quiet. The specific quiet of a situation that has completed itself. Harlan appeared at her side. He looked at Faye with an expression she couldn't fully classify. Not satisfaction, not anger. Something more neutral and more permanent than either of those. The expression of a man closing a very long account that has been open too long. Then he looked at Wren. "Go," he said. She went. The substructure door was open. She went through it and found the stairs 14 steps. She counted them as she descended, her hand on the wall because the stairwell was narrow, and the light here was a single fixture at the bottom that threw more shadow than illumination. The air changed as she went down. Heavier, stilled. The air of a space that has been sealed from the movement of the world above it, that has been holding whatever was put into it without exchange or renewal for longer than it should have held anything. Briggs was behind her with a light. The corridor at the bottom was narrow and concrete and had 3 doors on the left side. They were identical, the same gray metal, the same handle design, the same absence of markings. Nothing that said what was behind them. Nothing that acknowledged that anything was behind them at all. She moved past the first door. She moved past the second. She stopped at the third. Her hand went to the handle, and she couldn't move. She stood there with her palm against the cold metal, and she could not make herself turn it. And she understood this not as failure, but as the body finally being honest about what this moment cost. Every morning for 6 months, she had gotten up and made herself functional, had pressed the grief flat, and kept it there through the sheer force of having things to do. Every report filed, every phone call made, every shift worked with the loss sealed beneath her sternum like something she'd learned to breathe around. Every night she'd lain awake running Colt's face through her mind to make sure she still had it exactly right, because letting it blur felt like the beginning of letting go. All of that was on the other side of this handle. If the room was empty, it was over in a different way than she had let herself consider. If the room held what she had been moving toward for 6 months, she thought about Colt teaching her to ride a bike on the cracked sidewalk outside their mother's house. The way he'd held the back of the seat and then let go without telling her, and she'd ridden half a block before she realized she was doing it alone. And when she looked back at him, he was standing in the middle of the sidewalk, grinning with his arms crossed, and she'd been furious and exhilarated in equal measure, and she'd never quite forgotten the feeling of both at once. She thought about her 16th birthday when he'd worked a double shift to buy her the camera she'd mentioned once and hadn't thought he'd remembered. She thought about his voice on the 7th recording. "Someone will look." That was what he'd said. Not "I hope someone looks." Not "maybe someone will look." Someone will look. The certainty of it. The specific, unwavering faith of a man who knew his sister well enough to know what she would do when the cabinet doors stopped being left open. She turned the handle. The door opened. The room was small. Concrete walls, concrete floor, a cot against the far wall with a thin blanket pushed to one side. A single fixture in the ceiling that gave the space a flat, institutional light that flattened everything it touched. Briggs moved the beam of his flashlight, and it found the shape on the cot. Thin, in a way he hadn't been 6 months ago. She registered this as information before she could stop herself registering it the way the body sometimes delivers what the mind isn't ready to receive. His face had been rearranged by whatever this place had done to it, the angles of it sharper, something in the set of his jaw that hadn't been there before. Something that comes from weeks of holding yourself together in a space with no windows and no certainty of what comes next. But underneath all of it, underneath the weight loss and the weeks in this room and everything, this place had asked of him. He was entirely and completely Colt. She would have known him anywhere. She would have known him in the dark. He turned toward the light. His eyes found her face across the small room, and for a moment the sound of everything that was happening above them, the movement and the voices and the machinery of the night's events, still resolving themselves, fell completely away. "Ren," he said, "just that, just her name." In a voice wrecked by weeks of disuse, cracked and barely there, a voice that sounded like it had been put through something and had come through the other side of it, still carrying the essential quality that made it his. Everything she had been holding together for 6 months came apart. Not loudly, not in the dramatic way that things come apart in the stories people tell later, where the moment is clean and clear and fully understood in the instant it happens. In the quiet, complete way of something that has been under sustained pressure for a very long time and has just been given permission to release. Every shift she had worked with grief pressed flat beneath her sternum. Every cold cup of coffee, every night she'd lain awake, every report filed into silence, every phone call that rang out, every morning she had gotten up and made herself functional because there was no other available option, and the only alternative was to stop, and she could not stop. She crossed the room in 3 steps, and she held on to her brother with both arms, and she did not let go. He held on back. She could feel how much the holding cost his body the specific weakness in arms that had been through what his arms had been through, and he held on anyway with everything he had left. Behind her, she heard Briggs step back into the corridor. She heard him pull the door partially closed, leaving the light from the hallway to come through the gap. This small and deliberate act of privacy, offered without comment by a man who carried a death's head patch and had been in a gunfight less than an hour ago, and was also, it turned out, paying attention to what mattered. "I knew you'd come," Colt said into her shoulder. His voice was wrecked, but the certainty in it was intact. Some things the weeks hadn't touched. "You left me a recorder in a boot," she said. Her voice was not steady. She was not trying to make it steady. She was done with steady for the next few minutes at least. "Did it work?" "I'm here, aren't I?" She felt him exhale. A full, slow release, the exhalation of a man who has been holding himself together through pure will for longer than will is designed to sustain, and who has just been given permission to stop. The sound of a person setting something down that was very heavy. "Yeah," he said, "you're here." They stayed like that for a moment that had no useful length, not long enough, and longer than she'd known she needed. Then Colt said against her shoulder, "How bad is it up there?" "We handled it." "We..." She pulled back enough to look at his face. "40 Hell's Angels," she said. "And me." He stared at her for a moment. "That's..." He stopped. "Whose idea was that?" "Mine," she said. Another moment of staring. Then carefully, with the specific effort of a man whose face has been through a lot and is not entirely cooperative. Colt Calloway smiled. Not the full version of the smile she remembered. A construction in progress, but entirely real. "When did you get like this?" he said. "I've always been like this," she said. "You just never gave me enough reason to show you." He made a sound that in better circumstances would have been a laugh. She looked at him directly at his face, at the specific damage the weeks had done to it, at the thing underneath the damage that the weeks had not touched. "Can you walk?" she said. "I've been practicing," he said. "In here. 4 steps one way, 4 steps back. For about 6 weeks. She stood. She helped him stand, and he stood unsteady, careful, his body reacquainting itself with the mechanics of vertical, and then he was standing. Upright. In a room he had been kept in against his will, standing on his own feet. They went up the 14 stairs together, slowly. She matched his pace without commenting on his pace, the way you do for someone whose body has been through something and doesn't need you to mark the distance. At the top of the stairs, they came through the substructure door and back into the main space of the bunker. Harlan was waiting. He looked at Colt. Colt looked at him. The distance between them was about 10 feet, and across those 10 feet, past something that she couldn't fully decode because it was built from a shared history that existed before her and would continue after this moment, and was compressed now into a few seconds of eye contact that carried more than most conversations carry in hours. The specific weight of two men who trusted each other in a situation where trust was the most dangerous thing either of them carried, and who are now on the far side of what that trust cost. "You look terrible," Harlan said. "You're late," Colt said. His voice was barely there, but the specific dry tone of it was intact in hearing it. Hearing Colt be Colt, even in a wrecked voice, even in this room, did something to her chest that she managed by looking at the ceiling for a moment and then looking back. Harlan crossed the distance between them. He put his hand on the back of Colt's neck, not a grab a grip. The gesture of a man placing his hand on someone he considers his own, holding without holding on, acknowledging without performing any of the rituals that acknowledgement usually requires. He said very quietly, "Welcome back, brother." Colt closed his eyes, just for a second. 1 second there and gone, private and complete. Then he opened them and looked past Harlan at the bunker around him, at the ceiling and the walls, in the fluorescent light, and then past all of it to wherever he was looking, when he was seeing past the immediate room, to the fact of being outside the third room on the left, to the fact of air that had not been recycled through the same sealed space for 6 weeks. She looked away. Some things belonged only to the person feeling them, and the right response to witnessing them was not to witness them directly. She took his hand instead. He held on. The bunker was being systematically worked. She was aware of it in the periphery, men moving through the structure with purpose, carrying drives and files and hardware, stripping the operation down to its components and redistributing those components to places where Conrad Fay would have no access to them. 3 years of evidence that had been buried under Nevada because it was too specific to exist anywhere with a visible chain of custody. All of it moving now, through hands that were not Fay's, toward people who had been waiting for exactly this. Fay himself was outside by the time they came through the bunker exit. She saw him standing between two of Harlan's men in the pre-dawn dark, his composure restored to something approaching its original architecture. He was already doing the math on what came next. She could see it, already calculating his position for whatever room he would eventually sit in, already constructing the version of events that served him best. It was what men like him did. It was possibly all they knew how to do. She let herself look at him for a moment. He had taken her brother and put him in a room below the ground. He had done this as a tactical decision with the detached instrumentality of someone for whom people are variables in a calculation rather than facts in the world. He had built a career on the assumption that control was comprehensive, that if you controlled the information and the witnesses and the evidence and the systems that evaluated all three, you controlled the outcome. He had not accounted for the sister. She looked away from him and did not look back. Dutch was elsewhere. She didn't seek him out. She had nothing she needed to say to him that would change anything, and she had learned in 6 months of grief that the words you say to people who cannot receive them are spent on the wrong account. The anger she felt about Dutch Mercer was real and specific, and she would carry it for a long time, and carrying it was something she had gotten competent at. She would find a way to set it down eventually, or she wouldn't, and either way it was hers to manage and not his to witness. She walked out of the bunker into the cold Nevada air, and she stood next to Colt, and they both looked at the sky. The east was beginning to lighten. Not sunrise yet, that was still half an hour away, maybe more. But the specific blue that precedes sunrise, the sky's announcement of its intentions before the sun has cleared the horizon. A color that exists in that hour and no other, that you can only see if you are awake at the right moment, in the right place, which most people aren't. Colt looked at it for a long time without speaking. She let him look. Some things required no narration. Some things were just themselves, and the best thing you could do was stay present while they happened. The drive back to Hollow Creek took 2 hours. Colt slept for most of it, his head against her shoulder in the back of the van, his breathing slow and uneven in the way of someone whose body is conducting serious repair work and has commandeered every available resource for that purpose. She didn't move. She sat completely still and let him sleep against her and watched the desert lighten outside the windows as the sun began its climb. The sky went from the pre-dawn blue to gray to the particular pale gold of an Arizona morning. the color of a landscape that has been here long enough to be entirely comfortable with itself, that doesn't need to be dramatic about it because it simply and completely is what it is. Briggs sat across from them. He didn't speak. He looked out the other window and gave them the silence the way he had given them the closed door in the bunker. She was going to remember that about him, the specific, unprompted decency of it, the way he understood that some moments required privacy even in the middle of everything else. When the van stopped and she heard the crunch of the diner's gravel lot under the tires, she felt something in her chest change. Not release, it wasn't that simple or that complete, but a shift. The sensation of a knot that has been pulled very tight for a very long time, easing slightly in the direction of slack. Not gone, but looser. Looser enough to notice. Colt stirred when the engine cut out. He lifted his head and looked around with the blinking recalibration of someone returning from a distance. Then he looked at her. She watched his face do what it had been doing since she found him in that room, confirming in small and involuntary moments that she was real, that this was real, that the thing he had been holding on to in the dark had turned out to be true. "We're home," she said. He looked out the window at the diner. At the boarded front window, the plywood painted over in a color that didn't quite match. At the Route 66 sign still standing at the edge of the lot. At the gravel he had walked across so many times it should have been unremarkable, and wasn't because it was the first familiar ground he had seen in 6 weeks, and familiarity she understood now was not a small thing. It was the accumulated evidence of a life that was yours. "It's the ugliest building I've ever seen," he said. "I know," she said. "I missed it so much," he said. And his voice broke on the last word just slightly, and he turned his face toward the window, and she let him have that without marking it, because he had earned the right to have things without her watching. Gus was inside. She could hear him before the door opened, the sound of a broom on tile, the rhythm of a man cleaning something, because cleaning was what his hands needed to do when his mind had been somewhere difficult for too long. She pushed the diner door open, and Gus turned and looked at her, and his face did the complicated thing that faces do when they have been waiting a very long time to do it. Then he looked past her and saw Colt. The broom hit the floor. Gus crossed the diner in 4 steps and grabbed Colt by both arms and held on in the uncomplicated way of a man who has been afraid of something and is no longer afraid of it and has no interest in being graceful about the transition. "You look like something the desert coughed up," Gus said. His voice was extremely rough. "Good morning to you too," Colt said. 6 months, Gus said. 6 months you—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "I ought to," Gus, Colt said quietly. "I know." Gus pulled him in and held on. No performance in it, no self-consciousness. Just both arms in complete sincerity and the slightly awkward physical honesty of a man who is not accustomed to this and is doing it anyway, because the situation has exceeded his capacity for restraint, and he has decided that exceeding his capacity for restraint is the appropriate response. Wren stood and watched and felt the bittersweet quality of witnessing someone else's relief. Its own distinct emotion connected to her own relief, the way tributaries connect to the same river, but arriving through a different channel and carrying a slightly different weight. The men filtered into the diner around them. Some sat, some stood. The booth in the back corner was occupied again by Harlan, who said nothing and watched everything with those slow, deliberate eyes that saw more than they appeared to. She poured coffee without being asked. Her hands knew the motion, the weight of the pot, the angle, the sound of coffee hitting ceramic. She set a mug in front of Harlan and sat down across from him. "What happens now?" she said. "The files from the bunker servers get processed through channels that have nothing to do with Phase Network," Harlan said. "People I trust who know how to move information without leaving footprints back to us. It'll take a week, maybe 2, before it starts surfacing publicly. When it does, it won't come from us. It'll look like a leak from inside Faye's own operation. The kind of thing that happens when a man keeps too thorough a record of his own crimes. And Faye," she said, "in federal custody by this morning. Anonymous call with enough specifics that the people who've been watching him for years and haven't had enough to move on will finally have what they need." He paused. The evidence on those servers would stick to anyone. Will it hold? Fay built a thorough record of everything he did, Harlan said. The arrogance of a man who believed he controlled all the variables and therefore had nothing to fear from documentation. He looked at her. He forgot about you. She shook her head slightly. He forgot about Colt. Colt built that record. The recorder, the recordings, everything that pointed us to those servers, that was Colt. I just found the boot. Harlan was quiet for a moment. Then yes, he did. He looked at her steadily. I need you to say that to him, she said, when he's ready to hear it. He needs to know that you know what he did and what it cost him. Harlan looked at her for a long moment. I will, he said. She believed him. That was the thing she was carrying out of this night, that she hadn't expected to be carrying a complete and specific faith in this man's word. Not naivety, not the simple reversal of one assumption for its opposite. Something more calibrated than that. The understanding that reliability is not distributed along the lines that institutions draw, and that the most dangerous assumption you can make about a person is that the category they belong to tells you everything you need to know about them. Dutch, she said. What happens to him? Harlan was quiet for a long moment. Club handles it, he said. I won't describe it. I'm not asking you to, she said. I'm asking if he understands what he did. He understands what it cost him, Harlan said. Whether he has the capacity to understand what it cost Colt, some men don't. The equipment isn't there. She thought about Dutch's face on the floor, the calculation in it, the absence of the thing she had been looking for, which was some acknowledgement, however small, however involuntary, of the human dimension of what he had done. There had been fear. There had been the rapid arithmetic of a man assessing his remaining options. But there had not been the other thing. No, she said. I don't think he does. Harlan picked up his coffee. That's its own punishment, he said. Going through the rest of his life with only the consequences and none of the understanding of what they cost. He paused. Some men live their whole lives in that gap. She wasn't entirely sure she believed that was sufficient, but she appreciated the frame. She filed it away in the place where she kept things she wasn't done thinking about yet. Colt came and sat beside her about an hour later, moving with the careful deliberateness of a body that was still doing its accounting. He had eaten. Gus had produced food with the focused urgency of a man who had only one language for what he was feeling and was going to speak it as fluently as possible, and the eating had put some color back in his face. He still looked like a man with weeks of recovery ahead of him. He sat down and looked around the diner, at the plywood where the front window had been, at the men in the booths, at Gus behind the counter, finding things to organize that were already organized. You walked in here, he said, not to anyone specifically, more to the fact of the diner around him. You actually walked up to them. I heard the engine, she said. I recognized it as the opportunity. He turned and looked at her. His eyes were the same as they had always been, that specific shade of brown that was darker than photographs ever quite captured, warm and direct, without the filters most people install between what they actually think and what their face admits to. You could have been killed, he said. You could have been killed, she said. You went into something you knew was dangerous with a recorder in your boot because you decided someone had to be the friction. She held his eyes. So don't look at me like that. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he laughed, a real laugh, rough and short and genuine. The laugh of someone who has run out of the ability to argue because the argument has been thoroughly won. And he put his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into it, and they sat like that for a while in the diner that smelled like coffee and fresh plywood while the Arizona morning finished arriving outside the windows. The completeness of it was not the same as tidiness. Nothing about any of it was tidy. There was nothing tidy about what had happened or about what would still need to happen. The recovery, the federal proceedings, the long and careful work of aftermath that was already beginning to accumulate on the horizon. But completeness was different from tidiness. Completeness was about whether the essential thing was in place. The essential thing was in place. 1 week later, the first news report surfaced. She heard about it from Gus, who had the radio on in the kitchen and came out with his apron still on to tell her what he was hearing. A federal official under investigation. A facility in the Nevada canyons. Allegations of evidence tampering and financial crimes spanning 3 years. The reports were careful. They named Faye, but not the sources. They used phrases like anonymous tip and confidential informant in ongoing federal investigation. And they told exactly as much of the story as they had been given, which was not the whole story. The whole story was not in the news and would not be. She didn't mind. She was working the morning shift the day the motorcycles came back. She had just refilled the coffee for a couple at the counter, travelers passing through, the kind of people Route 66 delivered without warning or context when she heard the engines. Two of them, not 40, just two moving slowly down the main street of Hollow Creek, unhurried, the sound of people who have somewhere to be and are not rushing to get there. She set down the coffee pot. She walked to the window. Two motorcycles, rolling through the center of town in the early morning light chrome, catching the rising sun, the engines at low throttle. The lead rider turned his head toward the diner as he passed. Harlan. He didn't stop. He didn't gesture. He didn't perform any of the acknowledgments that would require the world around them to observe and interpret and incorporate into whatever story it was telling itself about this town and these men. He just looked toward the window where she was standing, and he nodded. Once. Small, deliberate, completely unambiguous. Not at a waitress, not at a civilian who had wandered into something she didn't fully understand. Not at someone to be managed or protected or accounted for. At a person he respected. At someone who had done what needed doing and had done it without being asked and had carried the weight of it from start to finish without putting it down. She nodded back. He rode on. Behind her, the diner continued its morning. Coffee brewing, the griddle heating. Gus in the kitchen beginning his rhythm, the familiar sounds of a man who has been doing the same things in the same space for a long time and has made his peace with the repetition, because the repetition is not a limitation, but a practice. The television above the counter was running a cable news segment about the federal investigation. The anchor's voice, smooth and practiced, presenting the story with the careful neutrality of someone who has been given facts and not context. A federal official, a facility, an investigation that had surfaced from what appeared to be a source within the operation itself. She was standing 10 feet away. The primary reason the investigation existed was standing 10 feet from the television refilling the couple's coffee. She picked up the pot. She topped off their cups. She smiled wide enough to mean it because she meant it. Anything else, she said. Just the check, honey, the woman said. We've got miles to cover. Don't we all, Wren said. She wrote it out. She set it on the counter. She turned toward the kitchen. Colt was in his booth. The corner one, the booth he had always claimed as his on the days he came in, positioned so he could see both the door and the window, which she had always attributed to a general preference for information, and now understood as something more specific, something that had been there long before any of this, and had simply been waiting for her to understand what it meant. He was sitting with both hands around his coffee mug, watching the window where the motorcycles had been. He had heard the engines. She knew from the set of his shoulders that he had heard them and had sat very still and let them pass. He hadn't moved, just sat and watched and let them go by and let the silence after them settle. You okay? She said. He looked at her. The look he'd been carrying since the bunker, gratitude, and something more complicated than gratitude. The expression of a man who went into the dark, expecting not to come out, and came out anyway, and is still engaged in the ongoing work of understanding what to do with that, still figuring out how to hold the fact of it without being held by it. I'm working on it, he said. Good enough, she said. She poured his coffee. She went back behind the counter. She picked up her order pad. The morning continued. Outside, Hollow Creek did what small desert towns do, persisted with the stubborn endurance of places that have no obvious reason to be there, except that someone stopped once, and then other people decided to stay, and the staying accumulated into a town, and the town accumulated into a home, and the home turned out to be worth the keeping, even when the keeping was hard. The heat was building. The sky was going white, blue, and wide, and certain of itself the way the Arizona sky always was in the morning before the afternoon arrived, and reminded everyone that the desert set the terms, not the people in it. She had the same hands she'd always had, the same apron, the same coffee pot. She knew the same diner the same way she had always known it, every scratch, every tilt, every click of the ceiling fan on every third rotation. But she had also walked up to 40 of the most feared men in the American Southwest and poured them coffee and told them the truth. She had handed the most dangerous thing she owned to the people everyone told her to run from, and they had used it to bring her brother home. She had gone into the dark and come back out with what she went in for, and the going in had cost her something, and the coming out had given her something. And she was still in the process of understanding what each of those things was and would be for the rest of her life. Hollow Creek had watched all of it, or not watched exactly, but felt. The way small towns feel things that happen inside them through the specific transmission of a place where everyone knows everyone, and news travels at the speed of one person telling another, which is faster than any broadcast and considerably more thorough and carries context that no broadcast ever manages to carry. She felt the difference in how people looked at her when they came in now. Not fear, not exactly reverence. Something more specific than either the regard people have for someone who did the thing that everyone around them decided was impossible and turned out to be simply very hard. The look that says, "I didn't think that could be done, and then I watched you do it." She had done the very hard thing. And Colt was in the corner booth working on OK, which was enough for today. Today was the only unit of time that had ever reliably been available, and she had learned in the past 6 months that working within available units was a skill worth developing, and she had gotten good at it. The ceiling fan clicked, the coffee brewed, the griddle heated. Gus sang something in the kitchen that he would deny having been singing if she mentioned it. A truck pulled into the lot outside, and the driver got out and stretched in the early heat and pushed through the door and settled onto a stool with the sigh of a man who has been driving for a long time and has been thinking about coffee for the last 30 miles and has finally arrived somewhere he can stop thinking about it and just have it. "What can I get you?" Ren said. "Coffee," he said. "Black." She poured it. She set it in front of him. She smiled wide enough to mean it, not so wide it looked like anything other than what it was. She picked up her order pad. She got back to work.